The air was thin and cold above the Bavarian countryside in the spring of 1945. Below, the wreckage of 1,000 dreams lay scattered. Factories turned to rubble, villages burned to ash, and a nation exhausted by years of total war. Inside a makeshift camp outside Augsburg, a group of German female prisoners huddled near a wire fence, their faces gray with hunger and disbelief. They had been nurses, clerks, auxiliaries, and secretaries in the Luftwaffe, the forgotten women of the Reich's collapsing war machine. Now they watched in stunned silence as a squadron of American aircraft roared low overhead. But what caught their attention wasn't the sound of engines or the insignia on the wings. It was the pilots who climbed out after landing on the nearby airstrip. They were women. Dressed in flight suits, hair tucked neatly under caps, they moved with confidence and ease, laughing as they exchanged brief handshakes with ground crews. To the German prisoners, raised on propaganda that glorified female obedience and dismissed female strength, the sight seemed impossible. Women, flying warplanes, commanding respect, wearing wings on their uniforms, it defied everything they had been taught. The war had ended, but for them a new kind of battle had just begun, one between old belief and the living proof of freedom walking right in front of them. The year was 1945, and Germany was collapsing under the weight of its own delusion. The once proud Reich, which had promised 1,000 years of dominance, was now reduced to smoldering ruins and empty eyes. Across the continent, cities like Berlin, Dresden, and Hamburg were seas of rubble. Allied bombers owned the sky. German civilians walked streets that no longer had names. Women, the backbone of the home front, bore the weight of defeat more visibly than anyone. For 6 years they had been told they were the heart of the nation, the silent, loyal mothers of soldiers, the guardians of purity and sacrifice. But now, stripped of power and purpose, they faced the truth of a world that had moved on without them. During the war, the Nazi regime had confined German women to the narrow ideals of Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church. They were not meant to lead, to command, or to fight. Even within the Luftwaffe, where some women had served as auxiliaries, their roles were limited to radio operations, administrative work, and nursing. The idea of women flying aircraft, especially in combat or command, was not just discouraged, it was ridiculed. Propaganda had painted a world where men were warriors and women existed only to serve those warriors. To question that structure was to question the state itself. But outside of Germany's walls, the world had changed dramatically. In Britain, women had taken to the skies through the Air Transport Auxiliary, the ATA, delivering Spitfires, Hurricanes, and even bombers from factories to frontline bases. In America, the Women Airforce Service Pilots, or WASP, had already flown more than 60 million miles, ferrying aircraft across the vast skies of North America. They trained like men, flew like men, and often died like men, though their names rarely appeared in newspapers. These women had become part of a quiet revolution, proving that courage, precision, and skill had no gender. By the time the Allies entered Germany in early 1945, these women pilots were not just ferrying aircraft, they were symbols of something larger, the freedom to choose one's own destiny. They were, in every sense, the embodiment of democratic power, the antithesis of the fascist ideal. To the defeated German women who watched them walk across captured airfields, the contrast could not have been sharper. Inside POW camps, the Americans and British began an enormous logistical effort to process millions of prisoners, including tens of thousands of women who had served in non-combatant roles. These camps were not places of cruelty but of reconstruction, attempts to dismantle a defeated ideology and replace it with understanding. Many of the female POWs were interrogated gently, given food, medical care, and a chance to rest. But beyond the humanitarian aid, something else was taking place. Exposure to a new world that they had never imagined existed. In some camps, particularly those run by American units with auxiliary support staff, women service members were part of daily operations. They worked as clerks, nurses, translators, and, most shockingly to the POWs, pilots and mechanics attached to the Allied Air Transport Command. The German women saw them walking through the same gates where they waited in line for food. Confident, respected, laughing freely among men without fear. For those raised in Hitler's Germany, where gender hierarchy had been sacred and rigid, this sight was disorienting. Nazi ideology had exalted the image of the male soldier as divine and treated the female body as a vessel of the future race. Women's independence was dismissed as weakness or moral decay. Yet here, in the very heart of defeat, they witnessed the opposite. These American and British women carried themselves with an ease that no propaganda could prepare them for. They wore trousers, leather jackets, flight goggles, and gloves. They spoke directly to men, challenged orders, and even instructed them. Among the German prisoners were former Luftwaffe auxiliaries who had worked at airbases like Rechlin, Gatow, and Fassberg, women who had once believed they served the most advanced air force in the world. They had seen men like Galland and Rudel held up as gods of the sky. Now they looked across the fences and saw female pilots, real women, not film stars or propaganda figures, climbing into cockpits of P-47 Thunderbolts, C-47 transports, and B-25 bombers. It felt as though history itself had inverted overnight. News spread quickly through the camps. Die Amerikanerinnen fliegen. The American women fly. Some dismissed it as a lie at first. Others laughed nervously, saying the Allies were flaunting a fantasy. But curiosity overcame disbelief. When trucks rolled by carrying female pilots in flight suits, the silence was absolute. One German prisoner later recalled, "We had been told that women who tried to act like men were broken, unnatural. Yet, when we saw them walk past, they were not broken. They were free. Freedom was the invisible weapon of the Allies. The bombs and tanks had shattered the Reich, but it was these quiet revelations, the sight of women in command, the experience of fair treatment, the exposure to open laughter, that truly dismantled what had lived inside." The American women did not preach or argue. They simply existed as proof that another world was possible. Many of these pilots were part of the Air Transport Command's European wing, tasked with moving supplies and personnel across liberated territories. They were not combat pilots, but their work was dangerous, demanding, and relentless. They ferried aircraft between France, Belgium, and occupied Germany. Some even flew into newly secured zones to deliver mail, medical supplies, or Red Cross packages. Their confidence, professionalism, and calm under pressure left an impression on everyone who encountered them, including the defeated Germans. The irony was not lost on Allied officers. In the Reich's final propaganda broadcasts, German women had been told that surrender to the Americans would mean humiliation, subjugation under decadent Western women who had abandoned their femininity. But reality proved the opposite. These female aviators embodied dignity, not arrogance. They carried compassion alongside competence. To the POWs, this was not just shocking, it was transformative. In later testimonies collected by post-war sociologists and Red Cross personnel, several German women confessed that it was this, not defeat itself, that first made them question everything they had believed. "It wasn't the bombing or the loss of our leaders," one wrote years later. "It was seeing women who lived without fear, who did not ask permission to exist." The encounter was more than symbolic. It was psychological reconstruction. For the Allied occupation forces, showing women in positions of respect and equality was part of a deliberate effort to reorient German society away from authoritarian control and toward democratic values. The presence of women pilots, nurses, and officers became a living demonstration that hierarchy was not destiny, that leadership could come with empathy, and that dignity did not require obedience. Through those months of transition, German female POWs saw the future before it arrived. The war had taken from them their nation, their identity, and their pride, but in return, it offered them something far greater, a glimpse of possibility. The women who once gazed in disbelief at flight suits and aviator caps began to imagine their daughters living differently. The engines of those Allied planes echoed beyond the camp fences, not as weapons of war anymore, but as symbols of movement, of progress. For many of the prisoners, those sounds would stay with them for the rest of their lives, a reminder that history's victors were not only those who conquered, but those who transformed. and for the women who had served the Reich and believed in its promises. That realization marked the true beginning of their freedom. A freedom measured not in borders or victories, but in the simple, undeniable truth of what they had seen. The change that began in those camps didn't stay behind barbed wire. It grew quietly, almost invisibly, through stories whispered between women who had lived through opposite sides of the same war. For the German prisoners, seeing female pilots was more than cultural shock. It was a collapse of ideology. They had been raised under a system that told them obedience was virtue, that discipline and submission defined womanhood. Yet the women they saw in Allied uniform, laughing freely, confident in authority, challenged all of that without a single word. Many of those American women pilots belonged to the WASP, the Women Airforce Service Pilots program. Though disbanded in December 1944, hundreds of its members had transitioned to support roles in Europe under the Air Transport Command. They were the backbone of a new kind of military logistics, flying everything from the P-51 Mustang to the twin-engine C-47 transport. These were not pampered poster girls, as some in the Reich believed. They were aviators who faced engine failures, storms, and the same risks as their male counterparts, often without recognition. To the German female POWs, most of whom had served as Luftwaffe auxiliaries or Red Cross nurses, the mere existence of such women felt like a myth made real. Some had once handled radios and decoded transmissions for male officers who looked down on them. They knew what it meant to serve without acknowledgement. They had worked endless hours beneath propaganda banners that reminded them of their duty to the fatherland, a duty that never promised them equality, only endurance. One of the most striking contrasts came during the Allied re-education programs that followed surrender. These programs weren't only about denazification, they were about exposure. The Americans believed that changing a nation began with changing its perception. They screened films showing life in democratic societies, lectures on civic rights, and even newsreels featuring women in the workforce, in universities, and yes, in the cockpit. For women who had been told that the highest form of honor was to raise children for the Reich, such images were electric. Within some POW camps, Allied officers organized small exhibitions about aviation. They displayed models of aircraft maps and photographs of American women in flight gear beside their planes. German women would gather near the tables, silent, observing every detail. The flight badges, the firm handshakes, the casual posture beside machines once considered sacred male territory. It was not humiliation they felt. It was awakening. One American pilot stationed at the Munich-Rhein airfield later recounted seeing a group of German prisoners, watching as she climbed into a C-47. They didn't speak, she wrote in her journal, but their eyes followed every movement. I could feel their disbelief. I wasn't there to make a statement. I was just doing my job. But maybe that was the statement. That quiet observation became one of the war's unspoken victories, the power of example over ideology. The Nazis had preached that strength came from dominance. The Allies proved it could come from dignity. The Germans' astonishment wasn't just about gender roles. It was about emotional contrast. Under Nazi control, emotion had been weaponized. Loyalty to the Führer replaced love of self. Fear replaced curiosity. The American women, however, radiated a different energy. Unafraid, expressive, individual. They smiled in photographs. They laughed with men as equals. They carried none of the rigid stiffness that German propaganda demanded of its ideal women. That difference hit deeply. Some German women began to wonder, what kind of society produces women like that? How could someone live without constant fear of stepping out of line? In post-war psychological studies conducted by Allied sociologists, many German female POWs admitted that their concept of womanhood had been shattered by these encounters. One report from 1946 summarized it plainly. Exposure to American women in uniform has caused among female prisoners a profound reevaluation of their own identity and purpose. They speak of feeling both ashamed and inspired. Meanwhile, the American pilots rarely thought of themselves as symbols of anything. Many were too busy to consider the historical weight of what they represented. They slept in tents, flew in freezing conditions, and worked under the same relentless schedule as the men. Their hands were often raw from oil and cold, their uniforms wrinkled and stained. They didn't see glamour, only duty. Yet to those watching from the other side of the wire, even that fatigue seemed revolutionary. At the same time, German women in occupied towns began encountering similar scenes. Female members of the U.S. Army Air Force's Women's Division, nurses, and Red Cross volunteers were stationed throughout Bavaria and Hesse. These women drove jeeps, operated field hospitals, organized supplies, and handled logistics that had once been the exclusive domain of men. Civilians saw them speaking freely with male officers, making decisions, commanding authority. For a nation that had been indoctrinated to view female independence as rebellion, this was nothing short of a revelation. The transformation was slow, but it was real. The post-war American presence, and particularly its female contingent, became the first window through which German women glimpsed democracy, not as a political theory, but as a lived experience. Some Allied commanders realized the power of that symbolism. In a 1945 internal memo from the Office of War Information, officers noted that American women in visible roles of competence and kindness are among our most persuasive instruments of re-education. It was not intentional propaganda. It was living truth. For the POWs, those moments left marks deeper than punishment ever could. A nurse from the Luftwaffe recalled years later, "When I saw those pilots walk together with men as equals, I realized the war we had fought wasn't only lost in battlefields, it had been lost in the mind long before." To understand how profound this shift was, one must remember that Nazi Germany had systematically erased female progress. Before the regime, during the Weimar Republic, German women had made remarkable strides: voting rights, education, professional careers. But when Hitler came to power, all of that was reversed. The regime dismissed women scientists, teachers, and artists in favor of domestic ideology. Posters declared, "Women of Germany, your world is your husband, your family, your home." The generation of women who became POWs had grown up believing that ambition was shameful, and now, the very nation that had defeated them was living proof of the opposite. When female pilots took off from Allied airstrips in occupied Germany, they sometimes passed over villages still smoldering from war. Children would run outside to watch. In the camps, prisoners would look up from their work details, shading their eyes to see the silhouettes of aircraft gliding through the sky. The engines left echoes long after the planes had vanished, and a strange, haunting reminder that power could sound different when wielded by those who did not seek domination. Among those deeply moved were the younger German women, many just in their 20s, who would later form the backbone of West Germany's reconstruction. They became interpreters, clerks, and educators under Allied administration. Some even joined initiatives designed to promote civic awareness and democracy among women. For them, the vision of female pilots and officers was not a distant fantasy. It became an example to emulate. In 1947, when American-run educational programs began offering courses in civic leadership and journalism to German women, attendance was overwhelming. Many of those who had been POWs applied. They wrote essays about freedom, equality, and dignity, ideas that had once been unthinkable. When asked what had inspired them, a recurring theme appeared in the records. "We saw women flying planes." That moment of realization rippled through post-war Germany, influencing generations that followed. From the first female journalists who covered the Nuremberg trials, to the women who entered universities in the late 1940s, the memory of those confident Allied aviators lingered. The impact was not just cultural, it was deeply personal. In private interviews conducted in the 1950s, several former German auxiliaries admitted they had torn down photos of Hitler in their homes, not because they feared Allied punishment, but because they could no longer respect a man who had denied them the right to be strong. That was the invisible victory of the war, not written in treaties or headlines, but in the quiet evolution of belief. The story of those female POWs and the women they saw across the fence became one of history's rare paradoxes. A war that had divided the world by hate ended up showing, through its victors, a glimpse of shared humanity. And that glimpse would soon collide with something even more profound. A moment when the realization of freedom wasn't just seen, but felt deep within the walls of captivity. It happened one gray morning in late May 1945, when the war had officially ended but its ghosts still lingered across Germany. The air over Bavaria hung heavy with the smell of damp earth and diesel fuel. At an airfield not far from Munich, Allied transport planes idled on the tarmac, their propellers slicing through the mist like clockwork. German prisoners, men and women alike, had been assigned to clear debris along the runway, salvaging twisted metal from the wreckage of Luftwaffe fighters that once symbolized their nation's pride. For many of them, the war was over in name only. Defeat still burned in their chests, sharp as hunger. That morning, as they worked under the watch of American guards, a distant hum grew steadily louder. Heads lifted. From the west, 3 planes approached in formation, sleek silhouettes against the pale sky. They were C-47s, the same aircraft that had carried paratroopers into Normandy and supplies into Holland. But these planes bore something unexpected. When they landed and rolled to a stop, the side doors swung open and out stepped pilots. Women wearing flight suits and leather caps, their faces wind-chapped but smiling. The German prisoners froze. Even the guards seemed to pause, as if acknowledging that this scene carried more weight than mere logistics. The women, members of the Air Transport Command, had arrived to deliver mail, medical supplies, and documents from the Allied headquarters in Frankfurt. To them it was routine. To the onlookers behind the wire, it was revolutionary. One of the German nurses dropped the piece of metal she had been holding. The clang echoed across the field. These were no actresses, no propaganda illusions. These were real women, pilots who had flown through cloud and cold, through the same skies once patrolled by the Luftwaffe's finest. They moved with confidence, unhurried, chatting casually with male officers as equals. Their posture alone defied everything the Reich had preached about womanhood. A few of the POWs whispered among themselves, disbelief spreading like electricity. Frauen? One muttered, women, Piloten, pilots. Others stood silent, staring through the wire as if afraid to blink and break the spell. For many of them, this was the first time they had seen women in command of men. It was a shock not born of envy but of awakening. The world beyond their camp, the world they had been taught to scorn as decadent, was not only surviving, it was soaring. The American women greeted the guards, then turned toward the German prisoners. Some offered small nods, even faint smiles, simple gestures of recognition that carried the weight of a moral victory. There was no arrogance in their faces, no mockery, only calm professionalism. For a moment, history seemed to stand still. 2 versions of womanhood faced each other through the barbed wire, one born of control and obedience, the other of choice and courage. The silence between them said more than any speech ever could. When the American pilots departed later that afternoon, the German women followed the planes with their eyes until the last echo faded. Something inside them shifted, something that no victory parade or lecture could have achieved. That day became a quiet legend within the camp. For weeks afterward, stories circulated. They came from Frankfurt, some said. They fly across all of Germany. They're not afraid of anyone. It was less rumor than reverence, a whispered acknowledgement of freedom in human form. Later, one of the Allied officers, a major in charge of logistics, noticed the change. The German women spoke differently. Their tone had softened, their expressions less bitter. A few even asked the camp library for English dictionaries, eager to understand the conversations they overheard. Others began volunteering for clerical work or language translation. For the first time, they sought participation, not submission. This small awakening echoed across other camps as well. In Darmstadt, Kassel, and Nuremberg, female POWs reported similar moments of confrontation with the modern world. The realization that the victor's strength came not from cruelty, but from equality. In the weeks that followed, several American female personnel, nurses, translators, and Red Cross officers were encouraged to interact more openly with German prisoners as part of the Allied re-education policy. They taught language lessons, explained daily routines, even discussed newspapers, and slowly, walls that had stood for 12 years of Nazi indoctrination began to crumble. The climax of this cultural collision came not with a gunshot or surrender, but with a smile. One afternoon, during an inspection at the same camp near Augsburg, a group of American pilots prepared to take off after delivering supplies. As they passed the prisoner's work detail, one of the pilots, a woman in her late 20s, caught the eye of a young German nurse standing nearby. The pilot smiled and gave a small salute before climbing into her aircraft. The nurse hesitated, then returned the gesture clumsily, half in respect, half in disbelief. It was an unrecorded moment, unseen by history books. But for those who witnessed it, it felt like the first sunrise after a long night. When the engines roared to life, the ground shook. Dust swirled around the prisoner's feet. The aircraft rose, tilting into the pale afternoon sky. The German women watched until the plane became nothing but a dark speck against the light. For a fleeting instant, they forgot who they were supposed to be. They weren't servants of a fallen empire anymore. They were simply human, women seeing other women claim the sky. One of the POWs later wrote in her diary, confiscated and archived by Allied censors, "It was as if they flew for all of us who never could. They were not like us, but they made us wish to be." That single line, preserved in faded ink, captures the heart of that moment. The collision between past and future, between captivity and awakening. The true turning point wasn't in that one camp. It was in what followed. Within months, Allied authorities began organizing women's councils in occupied Germany, encouraging female participation in civic reconstruction. Many of those who volunteered had been POWs just weeks earlier. They signed up to help distribute food, manage orphan records, and assist in rebuilding hospitals. The influence of what they had seen, of women commanding planes and purpose, was unmistakable. At the same time, American women pilots began returning home. Most were dismissed quietly, their service unacknowledged for decades. Yet their impact lingered far beyond medals or reports. They had not only helped win a war, they had helped redefine what victory meant. Their presence had become a mirror held up to the defeated, reflecting the possibility of a different world. When the German POWs were finally released in late 1946, many carried that reflection with them. Some emigrated, others stayed and joined the rebuilding effort. But all carried the same memory, the hum of engines, the smell of aviation fuel, and the image of women walking confidently into flight, unafraid of the sky. That moment, the moment of disbelief turned into recognition, marked more than the end of an ideology. It marked the beginning of a realization that freedom, once seen, cannot be unseen. The camps emptied, the planes flew on, and Germany, divided and scarred, began its long journey toward rebirth. And somewhere within that rebirth was the silent contribution of those who never fired a shot, but still changed the course of hearts. The women who flew, and the women who watched. The turning point had been reached. What followed would not be destruction, but transformation, the rebuilding of lives and of meaning in a world still trembling from the war's final echo. The war was over, but its shadows lingered in the corners of Europe, in the ruins of cities, in the eyes of the displaced, and in the memories of those who had lived on the losing side. By 1946, the American occupation of Germany had turned from military triumph to moral reconstruction. The world was rebuilding itself not just with bricks and treaties, but with ideas, and for the women who had once served a Reich built on submission, the most powerful idea was one they had never been allowed to imagine: freedom. The German female prisoners who had seen the American women pilots were among the first to carry that seed of change. Their lives after captivity were marked by a strange duality, the guilt of survival and the slow rediscovery of self. For years they had been told their worth depended on obedience, to the state, to men, to a belief system that glorified sacrifice. Now, standing amid the ruins of their nation, they faced a question that no propaganda could answer. Who were they, when no one was telling them what to be? Many returned to find their homes destroyed, families scattered, and communities suspicious of anyone connected to the Nazi system, even if their roles had been peripheral. They worked in soup kitchens, hospitals, and schools established under Allied supervision. It was in these places that they began quietly to practice a new kind of courage, the courage of thought. In the American occupation zones, re-education became an organized mission. Newspapers, radio programs, and women's forums encouraged discussions on democracy, human rights, and civic responsibility. For women who had spent their youth in an authoritarian culture, this new openness was as bewildering as it was liberating. One former Luftwaffe auxiliary wrote in a 1947 journal entry later discovered in a university archive, "We were taught never to question, Now they tell us questions are the beginning of freedom. It feels strange, but also right. Some of these women found work assisting Allied personnel. Those who spoke English helped translate interviews, organize records, or distribute supplies. The Americans treated them not as prisoners, but as people, sometimes even as colleagues. And it was in those small, mundane interactions that the true reconstruction began. A smile shared over paperwork. A conversation about music or books. A moment of mutual respect that broke through years of indoctrination. One of the most profound examples came from a camp near Wiesbaden, where a group of former German nurses was assigned to a makeshift hospital run by the U.S. Army Medical Corps. The head nurse was American, a woman in her 30s who had served in North Africa and France. She demanded precision, but she also offered kindness. The German women, initially wary, grew to admire her professionalism. She led without shouting, one recalled. We had never seen that before. Through moments like these, perceptions changed. Authority no longer looked like domination. It looked like competence. Leadership no longer meant control. It meant care. The psychological distance between conqueror and conquered began to close, replaced by something far more lasting: understanding. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the women pilots who had inspired such awe were facing their own battles. The WASP program had been disbanded without military status, its members sent home quietly as men returned from the front. Their service had been historic yet unrecognized. Many struggled to find their place in a peacetime world that was eager to return to traditional roles. They found work as flight instructors, mechanics, or secretaries, always carrying with them the unspoken weight of what they had done and what they had changed without knowing it. Though they never met, the fates of these two groups of women, the American flyers and the German prisoners, remained intertwined by legacy. The Americans had shown what was possible. The Germans had seen it and could never unsee it. By 1948, as West Germany began its slow recovery, a quiet revolution was unfolding beneath the surface. Women began entering universities again, applying for civil service jobs and taking part in local councils. When asked about their motivations, many cited not ideology, but exposure, a word that would appear repeatedly in post-war sociological studies. Exposure to democracy, exposure to choice, exposure to women who lived without fear. A particularly revealing survey conducted in the American zone in 1949 found that over 70% of German women under 35 believed women should have equal rights in employment and education, a radical shift from the pre-war mentality. Among those interviewed were several who had been prisoners during the occupation. One of them, a former radio operator for the Luftwaffe, said, "I remember the first time I saw an American woman in a flight suit. It was like seeing the future walk past me." The Allied command may not have realized it then, but those encounters had become the moral blueprint for post-war reconstruction. They weren't just dismantling a regime, they were planting the foundations of modern Europe. The aftermath of that transformation wasn't loud or dramatic. It came quietly, in the rebuilding of schools where women taught democracy instead of doctrine. In the birth of new publications written by female journalists who once believed politics was forbidden to them. In the election of women to local office, small victories that collectively reshaped a nation. For the German women who lived through it, the emotional weight was profound. They had spent their youth in uniforms that demanded silence, and now they were learning to speak. Some never reconciled with the past, others dedicated their lives to ensuring it never returned. A few emigrated to America, drawn by the same freedom that had once stunned them through a fence. They worked as translators, nurses, or teachers, and when they saw American women driving buses, running stores, or piloting small planes, they smiled with quiet recognition. Those who stayed in Germany became part of a transformation that would later define the new Federal Republic. They joined organizations like the German Women's Federation and the League of Women Voters. They advocated for education, equality, and remembrance. For them, the sight of women pilots had not been a symbol of defeat, but of possibility. It proved that identity was not dictated by ideology, that dignity could survive even after destruction. Decades later, as the world looked back on World War II, the grand narratives of generals and battles often drowned out these quieter revolutions. But the historians who listened carefully found their traces in diaries, letters, and interviews that revealed how deeply these moments had shaped hearts and minds. One passage from a German nurse's diary stands out. Written in 1946, it reads, "The Americans gave us food, but what they really gave us was something harder to swallow, the truth that women can be free." That truth became a cornerstone of post-war Europe. The generation that had grown up under the swastika would raise daughters who would later become teachers, scientists, and politicians, women who no longer saw the sky as forbidden. For the American pilots, history eventually caught up. In 1977, more than 3 decades after their service, the WASPs were finally granted full military status by the U.S. government. Many of them were elderly by then, their flight suits long since packed away. But when they stood together again, medals pinned to their uniforms, they represented not just the women who had flown for America, but the generations of women around the world whose lives had quietly changed because they had. It was a long road from those foggy Bavarian airfields to the halls of recognition, but history has a way of circling back to its truth. The sky that once divided victors and vanquished became, in time, a shared horizon, one where courage meant not domination, but understanding. And for the German women who once looked through barbed wire and saw what they thought impossible, that horizon remained forever etched in memory. The moment when defeat revealed not just loss, but light. The echoes of those propellers faded long ago, but their legacy still hums beneath history's noise, the sound of freedom breaking through disbelief, one flight at a time. Years later, when the dust of war had settled and Europe began to breathe again, that moment, the quiet encounter between captive and free, stood as one of the war's most human legacies. It wasn't written in treaties or carved on monuments, but remembered in silence by those who had witnessed it. The German women who once stood behind fences, stunned by the sight of American pilots in flight suits, would spend the rest of their lives reflecting on that contrast. Fear versus freedom, obedience versus purpose. What they saw was not just a difference in nations, but in spirit, a revelation that dignity didn't come from uniforms or ideology, but from choice. In that simple, unspoken exchange, a smile across the wire, a salute returned. 2 worlds met and understood one another for the first time. The Americans didn't preach. They simply lived what they believed. They carried confidence like it was oxygen, natural and unforced. To the German women, still shaped by the rigid discipline of the Reich, it was like seeing color after a life in grayscale, even though the world around them remained black and white. When those former prisoners became mothers and grandmothers, they spoke less of defeat and more of discovery. They told their daughters not about the propaganda that once bound them, but about the women who showed them what freedom looked like. And those daughters, growing up in a democratic Germany, carried that lesson forward, that strength and grace could exist together, that freedom could be kind. The legacy of those American women pilots outlasted the warplanes they flew and the headlines that forgot them. Their real victory wasn't in the missions they completed, but in the minds they changed, quietly, irrevocably. Across a broken continent, they helped redefine what it meant to win, not through dominance, but through dignity. And somewhere in the collective memory of that generation, the sound of those propellers still lingers, not as the noise of war, but as the rhythm of something new being born, the steady hum of freedom rising above the ruins carried by women who dared to fly,